The Selfish Giant by Oscar Wilde. Every afternoon on their way home from school, the children used to go and play together in the giant's garden. It was a large, lovely garden with soft green grass. Here and there beautiful flowers like stars stood gently nodding over the grass, and there were 12 peach trees that in springtime broke out into delicate blossoms of pink and pearl, and in the autumn bore rich fruit. The birds sat on the branches of the trees and sang so very sweetly that the children used to stop their games in order to listen to them. They felt quite safe because they knew the giant was not at home but had gone far away. "How happy we are here," they cried to each other. But one day the giant came back. He had been all the way to Cornwall to visit his friend the Cornish ogre, and had stayed with him for 7 years. After the 7 years were over, the giant had said all that he had to say, for his conversation was limited. And then he discovered that he had nothing left to talk about. That morning he made up his mind to return to his own castle. He said goodbye to his friend the Cornish ogre and thanked him for a pleasant stay. Then off he set, up hill and down dale, and before long his giant strides had brought him back to his very own front door. But the first thing he saw was the children playing in the garden. "What are you doing here?" he cried in a gruff voice, and the terrified children ran away. "My own garden is my own garden," said the giant. "Anyone can understand that, and I will allow nobody to play in it but myself." So he built a high wall all around it and put up a sign. He was a very selfish giant. The poor children now had nowhere to play. They tried to play on the road, but the road was very dusty and full of hard stones, and they did not like it. Sadly, they remembered the soft grass in the garden. When their school days were over, they would wander round the high walls and talk about the beautiful garden inside. "How happy we were there," they sighed, as they scuffed their shoes along the dusty road. Then the spring came, and all over the country little birds sang sweetly amongst the blossom. But in the garden of the selfish giant it stayed winter all the time. The birds did not care to sing in the garden, for there were no children. And soon the trees forgot to blossom. Once a beautiful flower poked its head out above the grass, but when it saw the giant's sign, it felt so sorry for the children that it slipped back into the ground again and went off to sleep. The only people who were pleased with the selfish giant were the snow and the frost. "Spring has forgotten this garden," they cried, "so we will live here all the year round." The snow covered up the grass with her great white cloak, and the frost painted all the trees silver. Then they invited the north wind to stay with them, and gusting and blustering he arrived, wrapped all in furs. All day long he roared about the garden, until he blew the chimney pots right off the roof. "This is a delightful spot," said the north wind. "We must ask the hail to come and visit." So the hail came. Every day for 3 hours he rattled on the roof of the castle till he broke most of the slates, and then he ran round and round the garden as fast as he could go. He was dressed all in grey, and his breath was like ice. "I cannot understand why the spring is so late in coming," said the selfish giant, as he sat at the window and looked out at his cold white garden. "I hope there will be a change in the weather." But the sweet spring breezes never came, nor the warm winds of summer. The autumn gave golden fruit to every garden, but to the giant's garden she gave none at all. "He's too selfish," she said. So it was always winter there in the giant's garden. And the north wind and the hail and the frost and the snow held hands and danced over the frozen ground and under the bare branches of the trees. One morning, the giant was lying awake in bed when he heard some lovely music outside his window. It sounded so sweet to his ears that he thought it must be the king's musicians passing by. But it was only a little linnet singing at the top of his voice. It was so long since the giant had heard a bird sing in his garden that it seemed to him to be the most beautiful music in the world. And then a strange thing happened. The hail stopped dancing over the castle roof, and the north wind ceased roaring. And a delicious perfume wafted in through the open window. "I believe the spring has come at last," said the giant with a slow smile. And he jumped out of bed and looked into his garden. What did he see? He saw a most wonderful sight. Through a little hole in the wall, the children had crept in, and they were sitting in the branches of the trees. In every tree in the garden he could see a little child, and the trees were so glad to have the children back again that they had covered themselves with blossoms and were waving their arms gently above the children's heads. The birds were flying about and twittering with delight, and the flowers were shyly peeping up through the green grass and laughing. It was indeed a lovely scene. But in one corner of the garden it was still winter. It was the farthest corner of all, and there stood a little boy. He was so small that he could not reach up to the branches of the tree, and sadly he paced all around it, crying bitterly. He longed to climb up as his friends had done, but he was just too short. The poor tree's bare branches were still covered with frost and snow, and high above it the noisy north wind blew and roared for all he was worth. "Climb up, little boy," said the tree, and it bent its branches down as low as it could, but the boy was too tiny. And the giant's heart melted as he looked out and saw the unhappy child. "How selfish I have been," he said. "Now I know why the spring would not come here. I will put that poor little boy on top of the tree, and then I will knock down the wall, and my garden shall be the children's playground forever." He really was very sorry for what he had done. So he crept downstairs and opened the front door quite softly and went out into the garden. But when the children saw him coming, they were so frightened that they scrambled down from the trees and ran away, and then the garden became like winter again. But the little boy did not run, for his eyes were so full of tears that he could not see the giant coming. And so the giant took him gently in his hand and lifted him up into the tree. And the tree broke all at once into blossom, and the birds came and sang on it, and the little boy stretched out his two arms and flung them around the giant's neck and kissed him on his rough cheek. And when the other children saw that the giant was no longer wicked, they came running back, and with them came the spring. "It is your garden now, little children," said the giant, and he took a great axe and knocked down the wall. And when the people of the village returned with brimming baskets from market at 12 o'clock, they found the giant playing with the children in the most beautiful garden they had ever seen. All day long they played, and in the evening they came to the giant to bid him goodbye. "But where is your little companion?" he said. "Where is the boy that I put into the tree?" The giant loved him the best because the little boy had kissed him, and the poor giant had never been kissed before. "We don't know," answered the children. "He has gone away." "You must tell him to be sure and come tomorrow," said the giant. But the children said that they did not know where he lived and had never seen him before, and the giant felt very sad. Every afternoon when school had ended, the children came and played with the giant. But the little boy whom the giant loved was never seen again. The giant was very kind to all the children, yet he longed for his first little friend and often wondered what had become of him. "How I would love to see him," he sighed. The years passed, and the giant grew very old and feeble. He could not play and run about any more, so he sat outside in a huge armchair and watched the children at their games and admired his lovely garden. "I have many beautiful flowers," he said, "but these happy children are the most beautiful flowers of all." One winter morning he looked out of his bedroom window as he was dressing. He did not hate the winter now, for he knew that it was merely the spring asleep, and that the flowers were only resting. Suddenly he rubbed his eyes in wonder and looked and looked. It certainly was a marvellous sight. In the farthest corner of the garden the tree had quite changed. Lovely white blossoms covered its golden branches, and silver fruit hung down from every bough. And underneath the tree stood the little boy that he had once loved. Joyfully the giant ran downstairs and out into the garden. He hurried across the grass and came near to the child. But when he grew quite close, the giant's face grew red with anger as he looked at the little boy. "Who has dared to wound thee?" he cried, for on the palms of the child's hands were the prints of 2 nails, and the prints of 2 nails were on his little feet. "Who has dared to wound thee?" asked the giant once again. "Tell me, so that I may take my big sword and slay him at once." "No," answered the child with a gentle smile. "Do not be angry, for these are the wounds of love." Then it was as if the giant's eyes were all at once opened, and humbled he knelt before the child. "Who art thou?" he said. And the child smiled at the giant and said to him gently, "You let me play once in your garden. Today you shall come with me to my garden, which is paradise." And when the children ran in to play that afternoon, they found the giant lying dead under the tree, all covered with white blossoms. But from then on, the spring always came early to the giant's garden, and in time the children's children played there just as they had done.